The state of Alabama has over 160 prisoners on death row. Let's see what crimes they committed and how long have they been waiting for their execution day. This is part 6 of the series. Alan Eugene Miller, 23 years on death row. He shot 2 co-workers dead in their office, then murdered a third person at a business he had previously worked for. He was apprehended shortly after the shootings when authorities forced him to stop after seeing him on the nearby Interstate 65. He got into a quick fight with the police. In the shooting murders of co-workers Lee Holbrooks, 32 years old, and Scott Yancey, 28 years old, at Ferguson Enterprises, as well as Terry Jarvis, 39 years old, at Post Airgas, Miller pled not guilty due to mental illness or defect. Miller drove a truck for Ferguson, and up until January he worked for Post Airgas. Jarvis was a Post Airgas supervisor. Holbrooks and Yancey worked for Ferguson. Miller was fired from Post Airgas in January and was driving a Ferguson truck at the time of the incident. According to a buddy of Holbrooks, Miller was upset because he believed another driver, Holbrooks, was getting longer and better routes than he was. According to reports, Miller had a history of altercations with co-workers and had once been dismissed for fighting at work. The Birmingham News reported that Miller frequently engaged in yelling matches with one of the 3 individuals he is accused of killing on August 5 based on interviews with his former co-workers and bosses. Miller was also a dedicated worker who kept to himself according to his former co-workers as well. He is now 58 years old. Jeffrey Lee, 23 years on death row. With a hidden shotgun, Lee entered Jimmy's pawn shop in Orville on December 12, 1998. Elaine Thompson and Helen King, 2 employees, as well as Jimmy Ellis, the owner, were shot by Lee. Ellis died from a gunshot wound to the chest, and Thompson died from a gunshot wound to the face, according to the coroner's testimony. King, who had also been shot, recovered and provided testimony during Lee's trial. King claimed that he pulled a shotgun and shot Ellis, Thompson, and her. She stumbled to the ground before acting lifeless. Lee departed the shop, and King claimed that after getting up, she called emergency 911 and shut the store's doors. She claimed that Lee attempted to enter once more, but departed when saw the doors were shut. The events were also captured on camera by surveillance. The videotape, which proved King's account, showed Lee shooting the victims. Although Lee admitted to shooting and killing the pawn shop's occupants, he claimed the first shot was accidentally discharged. Lee is now 47 years old. James Donald Yeomans, 22 years on death row. He was convicted for the murders of his ex-wife and her parents. This crime was very hard to read about as the majority of the events unfolded in front of 4 kids. They saw their grandparents and mother being severely beaten, and then they heard the gunshots that killed them. Jake and Sylvia Simmons were the grandparents, and Julie was the wife. All 3 of them had autopsies performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Alfredo Paredes. Jake Simmons sustained many blunt force traumas to his face, as well as to the top and rear of his skull. The numerous fractures in Jake's face bones caused the left side of his face to half collapse. Jake was shot at least once through the face and the head, in addition to getting defensive wounds to his right hand. He was still alive when all of the wounds were administered because of the bruises around the wounds. Sylvia Simmons allegedly sustained numerous cuts, fractures, and bruising to the inside of her brain as a result of the wounds. Sylvia was reportedly hit on the head at least 10 times. At least some of the head wounds Sylvia sustained occurred while she was still alive, and she also received a bullet wound to the right cheek, which exited through the back of her head and lodged in the left side of her brain. A severe hit to Sylvia's left wrist resulted in a fracture and a malformation of both wrist bones. The wrist wounds were defensive wounds, according to Dr. Paredes, and they were consistent with the size of the metal pipe that was found at the site. Sylvia also had defensive wounds to the back of her right hand, right arm, and wrist. Both a gunshot wound to the face and blunt force injuries to the head contributed to Sylvia's demise. Julie was shot numerous times and had her skull smashed. One of the bullets entered Julie's neck on the right side and exited the body through the rear of her center chest. Another bullet brushed her face and went through her earlobe. Another one went through her right cheek. A third one went through her right temple. Julie's brain contained shards from 2 of the bullets. She also had gunshot wounds in her mouth and right eye. Dr. Parades believed that Julie had been shot multiple times but had always been alive because there was bruising around the entrance wounds. Yeomans is now 60 years old. Cuauhtemoc Peralta, 22 years on death row. Peralta was incarcerated for the rest of his life without the possibility of parole because he killed 3 people during a heist at a Popeyes restaurant. In a prison in Alabama, Cuauhtemoc Peralta and 2 other conspirators would kill another prisoner by stabbing him. The victim's body underwent an examination by Dr. Leroy Riddick, a medical examiner with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. The prisoner's name was Lewis, and he sustained a total of 18 different wounds, including 6 stab wounds. His carotid artery was severed by a single stabbing to the neck. A lung collapsed as a result of another chest stab. In addition, he had multiple superficial cuts and scrapes. Dr. Riddick came to the conclusion that knife wounds and cuts caused by sharp force injuries were the cause of death. Peralta is now 47 years old. Donald Deardorff, 22 years on death row. Ted Turner was a Unity Church minister, a businessman who owned a warehouse and rental buildings, and the father of 2 kids. He disappeared in September 1999. After Millard Peacock, a co-defendant of Deardorff, helped investigators looking into Turner's disappearance and directed them to the body, Turner's decomposing remains were found in a rural part of Baldwin County in July 2001. Turner had rented a storage facility to Donald Deardorff and Christy Andrews starting in 1998. At some point, Deardorff stopped paying the warehouse's rent, and Turner filed a lawsuit in district court against Deardorff and Andrews. After the couple was kicked out of the warehouse, over $3,000 default judgment was rendered against them on July 27, 1999. Turner was attempting to confiscate some assets through the court procedures because Deardorff and Andrews had left a number of disassembled automobiles, vehicle components, and tools in the warehouse. This was the motive for which Deardorff decided to rob and murder Ted Turner. Deardorff is now 58 years old. Anthony Eugene Brown, 21 years on death row. Virginia Keel, 83 years old, was strangled with a piece of fabric on June 19, 2000, and had cloth and tape placed over her lips and nostrils. Anthony Eugene Brown was responsible for Mrs. Keel's death. This violation took place at 22 Trillium Circle, apartment 1007, Dothan, Alabama, while Anthony Brown was breaking into Virginia Keel's house without permission. The police was called to the scene by a neighbor who saw something that made him think someone was in trouble in that apartment. When Corporal Heath and Officer Youngblood entered the apartment, they saw a black man in the kitchen area. The man said, "You've got me, you've got me. She is only restrained in there. I did not harm her." The man was then restrained by Officer Youngblood using handcuffs. This man was Anthony Eugene Brown, and he was then put in the back of Officer Gill's patrol car. A senior woman named Virginia Keel was lying on the floor when Officer Youngblood entered the bathroom. An extension cord was wrapped around Mrs. Keel's hand roughly 6 times before being manipulated in a knot. There was only one strand of cable connecting Mrs. Keel's wrists to her feet, and it was too short for her to extend her legs. Her mouth was stuffed with a piece of a t-shirt, and her head was around 15 to 20 times wrapped in a black duct tape. Mrs. Keel's neck was wrapped in a single knot made from the remaining t-shirt material. She was given CPR right away by the officers, who continued until paramedics came. Mrs. Keel received advanced life support from the paramedics, who then transported her to the Southeast Alabama Medical Center. Dr. David Williams started treating Mrs. Keel as soon as she got to the hospital. He diagnosed Mrs. Keel as being in status epilepticus and started her on anti-seizure medication. Mrs. Keel was not breathing and had a dismal prognosis. She passed away on June 29, 2000. Brown is now 48 years old. Wilson Billy Robital, 21 years on death row. Robital traveled from Phoenix City, Alabama to Hamilton, Alabama early on May 11, 2001 to commit a home invasion on a couple he had met while residing there in the late 1990s. He believed he knew where the jewelry was stored in the home of this couple because he ran a jewelry store. He waited for the couple to leave the house, but the man did not exit the premises, so he decided to find someone to lend him the money to go back home. He actually did meet someone that was able to help him out, but he was too proud to ask. He eventually found himself at the residence of Stuart Taylor, his wife Alyssa, and their 2 kids. He had previously worked for the Taylors and had even stayed in a camper in their backyard while repairing their home. The Taylors were people he knew quite well. Alyssa Taylor opened the door for him after he knocked on the kitchen door of the Taylor's residence. When Alyssa left the room to take care of the kids, they were seated at the kitchen table and having a conversation. Robital went over to Alyssa's handbag on the counter while she was away to grab the money he needed to buy gas to drive back to Phoenix City. Once more, he was too proud to ask for help. She unexpectedly returned to the kitchen and discovered what he was doing as he was in the middle of searching through her purse. She approached him quickly in an effort to stop him. Robital started using a Leatherman's or other multifunctional tool to stab Alyssa Taylor. She made an effort to flee by sprinting to a different room. When Robin, her daughter, started screaming, Robital followed her and grabbed a steak knife to pursue her. Robin managed to escape the kitchen through the carport, but Robital managed to catch her and bring her back inside. He followed her into her bedroom and stabbed her till she was dead after breaking the blade of one steak knife off in her back. After that, he headed upstairs to where Trent and Alyssa were. He was questioned by Alyssa about his motives. He responded by saying he had already gone too far. He continued stabbing her until she was lifeless and dying on the ground. Trent had been instructed by his mother to hide in a storage space behind the door in the bedroom, but Robital tracked him down and fatally stabbed him. He then went back outside into the hallway and apologized to Alyssa, but she could not speak anymore. Since some of the stab wounds did not flow, suggesting no blood pressure at the time they were inflicted, it was established that he went back to each victim and stabbed them again to make sure they were dead. He then proceeded to steal knives, scissors, coin-filled flasks, and Alyssa's purse and its contents. He then took off for Phoenix City, where police caught up with him. When Stuart Taylor returned home on May 11, 2001, he found the bodies of his wife and daughter. Later, cops located his son's body as well. Dr. Joseph Embry testified that Alyssa had received 18 stab wounds, Robin had received 17 stab wounds, and Trent had received 10 stab wounds. Robital is now 57 years old. Rex Allen Beckworth, 21 years on death row. Bessie Lee Tweet, the victim, was at home on the evening of January 5, 2000. The 87-year-old woman had resided in the same house for the past 67 years. She weighed about 112 pounds and she had a reputation for keeping cash in both her house and her car. The Tweet residence was broken into by Rex Beckworth and his stepbrother James Earl Walker on that night. The phone lines to the house were down and the exterior carport light was broken. The attacker shattered the house's back window to gain entry. Later, inside Mrs. Tweet's plundered home, Mrs. Tweet's body was found covered in blood and she was pronounced deceased. Beckworth is now 56 years old. Willie Earl Scott, 21 years on death row. At 19 years old, Willie Earl Scott resided with his grandmother. The home was also occupied by 10-year-old Latonia Sager, her younger sister, and their mother, Latrice Sager. There also resided Latrice's brother Albert, his partner Shanika Scott, and their 2 kids. Scott and Shanika were cousins. When Scott's grandmother awoke during the night of September 11, 1999, she witnessed Willie Scott leaving the house in a Lexus car that had been parked outside. Albert was looking for a broom downstairs the following morning. He was instructed by Latrice to check Latonia's chamber. Latonia's chamber door was locked, and when Albert pounded on it, she did not respond. Latrice and Albert entered the room when Albert unlocked the door. Latonia was partially covered by a sheet and appeared to be sleeping on her stomach. When Latonia's foot was touched by Latrice, she felt the coldness. Latonia was gone. After that, Latrice discovered that both her rifle and the Lexus were missing from their respective locations in her bedroom and driveway. Scott went on to essay another girl multiple times before she was able to escape and call the police. He is now 43 years old. Alfonso Morris, 20 years on death row. Court records state that he broke into the home of Miriam Rochester, who was 85 years old, and beat her to death. According to the testimony of the first officer on the scene, the door showed pry marks which indicated forceful entry. Some of the jewelry that was recovered from Morris's possession was recognized as the victim's by Rochester's granddaughter. Rochester's blood was identified on Morris's foot, and Morris' DNA was discovered on a cigarette butt that was discovered in the Rochester's home. Morris is now 62 years old. Rick Allen Bellisle, 20 years on death row. When Rick Bellisle and his wife looted the convenience store where she once worked, Joyce Moore, the clerk, was shot and she died. Joyce Moore was attacked by Rick Bellisle. He used a huge can of peas and a metal pipe from an electrical fan stand to severely beat her. Before she passed away, the victim went through excruciating pain and suffering. Bellisle repeatedly hit the woman with the metal pipe as she stood up on her arms to beg for help after she had been beaten until she was bleeding to death and lying face down on the ground in her own blood. This prevented her from standing up because her arms were under her and she was unable to move. Following that, Joyce Moore's injuries from Rick Bellisle's assault caused her death. Annette consented to provide testimony against her husband Rick Bellisle in exchange for a 20-year sentence. In her testimony, Annette stated that her husband and her were both out of job, broke, and unable to purchase food prior to the murder. He is now 54 years old. Michael Jerome Lewis, 20 years on death row. Lewis was found guilty in 2003 of killing Timothy John Kay in 1997. James Anthony Free, a second guy, was also found guilty and given the death penalty, but his sentence was later changed to life in prison. Lewis, Free, Kay, and another individual proceeded to Lewis's mobile home in Houston County, according to court documents. Free and Kay got into a fight, and during the struggle, Free hit Kay in the head with a beer bottle and his fist. Lewis eventually joined in the altercation as well. After that, Free and Lewis got into a fight over who would shoot Kay. The severely wounded Kay was then shot twice in the head. Kay was brought into Holmes County, Florida, in the back of his pickup truck after crossing the state border. Then Lewis and Free dumped Kay's body into the river from a bridge over Highway 2. Later, Lewis and Free took Kay's truck back to Houston County, where they lit it on fire in a field next to Sonny Mixon Road. Lewis is now 70 years old. James Earl Walker, 20 years on death row. James Walker was the co-defendant in the trial of Rex Beckworth regarding the murder of Bessie Lee Tweet, 87 years old. The victim's autopsy was performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Alfredo Paredes. Due to the gunpowder residue on the victim's face, he concluded that she had been shot at close range. In addition, he found 3 cheek fractures and multiple facial lacerations. There were 9 blunt force trauma injuries in total, including 2 skull fractures. The gunshot wound to the victim's head occurred after the blunt force trauma injuries occurred, while the victim was still alive. Walker is now 44 years old. Oscar Roy Doster, 17 years on death row. After their escape from the Covington County Jail on November 4, 2002, Bobby Phillips and Oscar Roy Doster were found guilty of numerous offenses they had both committed together. The shooting death of Paul LeMaster was the worst of these atrocities. Phillips, who admitted to being the triggerman in that killing, was found guilty of 3 charges of capital murder and given the death penalty by the jury. Following his second escape from the Covington County Jail, Doster was charged with murder in the killing of Dennis Courtney in Fairfield, Texas. Doster is now 48 years old. Brandon Dion Mitchell, 16 years on death row. At the Birmingham Airport Inn, Roderick Byrd fatally shot Dorothy Smith, 58 years old, John Aylesworth, 42 years old, and Kim Olney, 28 years old. Brandon Mitchell blamed Roderick Byrd for the shooting, and Byrd blamed Mitchell. Byrd shot Aylesworth, according to the prosecution, and Mitchell killed Olney and Smith. Mitchell is now 42 years old. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.